And here are recorded the names of some of the few who saved Britain and the Allied cause in 1940.
Ever wondered what daily life was like for a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain? As daughter of World War II pilot Wing Commander Bob Doe, historian Dr Helen Doe has some unique insights on how the differences in squadrons, class, and leadership styles affected everything from how pilots celebrated, dressed, functioned, and relaxed, as well as how leaders approached LMF, lack of moral fibre.
Well, the two biographies, that I've written are the one of my father, the first one, and he was based in Middle Wallop, and then the other one was Stamford Tuck, and they are very different. They're very different personalities, and one also gets the impression that the squadrons they were in were very different, because the kind of life you led was very often dictated by the kind of atmosphere within that squadron. So Tuck, for instance, joins Roger Bushell's squadron, which is brand new. Bushell is just establishing this from scratch. And Bushell has come from the Auxiliary Air Force, which is a very kind of aristocratic style of doing things in a very privileged way. And so that Bushell starts off leading it in that way. This changes when things get serious. But so to begin with, it's kind of a high life, lots of parties, and that's the atmosphere. Whereas the squadron my father was in initially in the battle, 234, didn't seem to have that same atmosphere. So that's quite an interesting difference in the two. So it very much the sort of style of celebration, style of how you were, depended enormously, on the squadron leader, and then the kind of ethos of that squadron. So Bushell was very different to the initial leader that my father had at Middle Wallop. I think both of them were probably great readers of Biggles when they were young. And Biggles, of course, it's always this big thing that you got 3 kills and you were an ace. So in my father's case, when he becomes an ace, he doesn't have a big celebration in the bar. He has a quiet pint of beer in his room, which says something, because everybody else would have known about it, but also says something about the way that squadron celebrated things. Now, contrast that with Tuck's squadron. They go into their first action against the enemy in Dunkirk, over Dunkirk. On the first day, they lose a lot of men, including Roger Bushell, who's shot down, made prisoner of war. They become an incredibly successful squadron, although I think with Dunkirk, we do have to say that sometimes the scoring on both sides was dubious. But Tuck talks of these incredible parties that went on, where, they've got a band playing, people are having this wonderful party, dancing away. But one of the pilots starts playing the piano, is downing as much drink as he can, but also starts taking Benzedrine. And he plays so fast and so fantastically that the band has to give up. It can't keep up with him because he's on such a high. So you hear these stories of various squadrons and squadron life, but not from every squadron. So I'm saying they're very different styles in different squadrons. Another thing that happens that affects the life of a fighter pilot is not just the squadron they're in, but the base they're on. Because, of course, there is another authority on the base, which is the wing commander in charge of that station. And they lay down the rules about various things and about when they can go out to their dispersal points and how they get fed. And at the beginning of the war, some of these desk-bound officers who were given the nickname by my father of penguins. These were the ones who flapped but didn't fly. So they were really sort of, you used to get very annoyed with them, coming up with these petty rules, which the administrators were trying to do to control things on the base, but which the fighter pilots were saying, well, the Luftwaffe aren't playing by these rules. Why should we have meals at certain times? Because the Luftwaffe doesn't. They're coming over, we've got to go up. So we need our food, and we are not going to dress appropriately. We are going to just want our food, because we've then got to get into our aircraft and fly again. So this impinged on various bases and on the style of what was going on with the squadron. So I think we've got to bear that in mind as well. Now, the sort of typical thing would be you'd be woken up early in the morning by your Batman, who would bring you, I think in my father's case, they said incredibly strong tea, usually in the early hours. And then you were taken to your dispersal point, ready and waiting with the other guys. And of course, the other thing you got to remember then is you're waiting there with all these other guys ready for the shout to head off. But you've got to remember that you have both sergeant pilots and officer pilots at that time. They all mingle, whereas back on base, they've got their separate mess arrangements. When it comes to dispersal, they all mingle together and they fly together. They're doing exactly the same job together, so they see no difference. The only difference is when they get back at base. So call comes in, the scramble comes, and they head off. During the day, they might be up 2-3 times, but these are really short, incredibly intense adrenaline moments. They might be up, they might be vectored to go and meet quite a large formation coming in. And to a certain extent, it was every man for himself. At the beginning of the war, they stuck to formations, but they quickly realized this was a big mistake. And so what later on many of them did was they developed pairings. So they'd have a wingman with them to help them in that situation. But they'd be up for that really intense period, and because it was to be a very short period because their fuel wouldn't last that long. So you're up there fighting the enemy in this multi-dimensional war game in the air, but also keeping another eye on your fuel. So you're looking at your ammunition, how much ammunition have you used? Because that's the other thing, your ammunition will run out. And then you haven't got much choice apart from ramming the enemy, which is not always a good idea. And you then have, with this problem with fuel, you regularly get stories of pilots coming in, because they're short of fuel, having to land at another base. And if they're lucky, they can refuel, or if they've had to parachute out of their aircraft, they land somewhere and they then end up being transported back across the country, back to their base again. Those of the squadron who've made it back to base are anxiously waiting to hear what's happened to the rest of their colleagues. Sometimes they'll get a phone call to say somebody's landed to refuel at another airfield. Sometimes they just phone to say that they parachuted out and they're now on a train somewhere. Or they don't hear anything and wonder what's going on. The other thing that happens is the way that they celebrate. I've already mentioned this fact, parties in the mess, which some of them had. The messes were interesting because you didn't, in the officers' mess, you didn't have a bar as such. So don't think of it like a kind of pub. You would have a room, which is kind of like your sort of main sort of sitting room, and you'd ring a bell for somebody to bring you a drink. So that was and to a certain extent they could, to a certain extent, control, because drinking was an issue. And sometimes they tried to control that in various ways, not always easily, because they recognized these men needed to let off steam. But many of them, I think, ended up with hangovers the next morning, which I think the general remedy was take a whiff of oxygen once you're up. That seemed to be the way to deal with a quick hangover. It amazes me, and I think it amazes us today, if we think about elite sportsmen and women today who have taken no alcohol, watch their diet exceptionally carefully. These guys were drinking like crazy, smoking heavily, staying up, many of them have stayed up till all hours, and then were being scrambled the next morning to go and fight. It's quite an incredible concept when you make that comparison, because they were the elite sportsmen of their day. And so yes, celebrations off airfield, therefore, were to be prized as well. Sometimes you wanted to get away from the airfield. And so Biggin Hill, it was the famous White Hart was the place they would go to, much encouraged by the landlord and landlady of the time, who also, I think she became she was quite a character and really looked after them and helped and encouraged this atmosphere. But for Middle Wallop, they didn't have a similar White Hart, but they did occasionally go out to local pubs. And that was quite interesting because they went to my father recalls going to a local country pub. And again, you get this impression that it wasn't a big rowdy do, it was a quiet thing. There were several locals, farmers, etc. in there, who to begin with kind of ignored the fighter pilots, just left them to themselves. But after a while, after a couple of pints, they began to ask questions. And so the fighter pilots then told them what they could, and the locals just kind of encouraged them. But you get this impression of a rather quieter kind of thing than the sort of thing that was going on at the White Hart. This is why I'm saying there's very different styles, different squadrons as to the kind of atmosphere that went on. So, certainly the ones that Tuck was involved in and probably Malan, some of them were pretty heavy drinking and a lot of partying. And if you were based somewhere handy for London, as Tuck and Malan were, you could easily get into London. And that was the great thing. So you could get into London, you could go to dances and parties and pubs there and be welcome. Because once after Dunkirk, the RAF had a really bad name. But as word of what the RAF were doing during the Battle of Britain, they became the heroes. And so they were warmly welcomed and encouraged, and people would buy them drinks, etc. when they met them. Because these were all the rich people who were flying at weekends. So, they've got money to throw around. Other squadrons, as they developed, these guys were people who, like my father, didn't have the money. They couldn't throw money around, and their mess bills, they couldn't afford it. So you've got big differences in atmosphere in terms of the way the leader of that time runs it, which is also quite interesting when you think about when Malan takes over other squadrons. They go into a culture that already exists, which is also quite interesting, I think, because they then have to impose their way of doing things. But if they're sensible, they don't totally change the culture, because that would be too resistant. Because these guys have lived and breathed that for a period of time. It's probably worth also considering in terms of the lifestyle and the kind of persona that the fighter pilots wanted to put across. They wanted to look a certain way, and certainly the more impressionable younger ones, this thing about leaving your top jacket button undone, and initially they're wearing collars and ties, and then they're wearing because when you're in the air, moving your head around, that rubs your neck, so they're wearing loose scarves and things like that. So some of them start to take on a very affected style. As I say, particularly the younger, more impressionable ones. At the back of a lot of this, there is real fear. There's not only fear about what's going to happen to you the next morning, which some will think about more than others, and that goes down to different personalities. But the other underlying thing is the concern about LMF and how you present yourself. LMF, lack of moral fibre. This was a term that began to be used really from after the retreat from France, where the RAF was concerned about the phrase they used, these men who had lost the confidence of their commanding officer. Medical officers were asked to look at someone who they thought had got the nerves, become nervy, jittery, and who would come up with all sorts of reasons why they couldn't go out that day. There was a problem with their aircraft or something. Nobody wanted to be labelled with this LMF. It was a horrible label, and what Park particularly was interested in when he was looking at it, he wanted anybody that showed signs of this developing this label. He wanted them out of that squadron quickly, because they saw it as potentially influencing the others. And once you got one jittery individual, somebody else gets nervy, and so on. There was always, I think, at the back of the mind, nobody wanted that. So you also had to be careful the way you came across. So I think this gung-ho attitude and the, up on atoms type of attitude was really important to put that front on. Two biographies where I looked in detail at two pilots, both of them flew both aircraft during this period. So They both loved the Spitfire and absolutely said that was their favourite aircraft for all sorts of reasons. But they admired the Hurricane for it being workmanlike. It did the job it was needed. The Hurricanes, the ideal situation was the Hurricanes would attack the bombers, and the Spitfires would attack the fighters, the German fighters. So that didn't always work out that way, but that was the sort of plan. They admired both aircraft, but just loved the Spitfire. Yeah, this was, my father described it as having wings on your back. It was just a wonderful aircraft.
Face the Attack, The Three Battles of Sailor Malan was written and produced by Protea Originals. To receive weekly episodes plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com.